I am Lily, 29 years old. The ink on my graduate degree had barely dried when I made a decision that would carve the fault lines in my family deeper than any earthquake. I had grown up in that sprawling estate, the polished marble floors, the chandelier that seemed to hold captured sunlight, the scent of old oak that clung to every hallway. My grandparents had built it not only as a home, but as a fortress of memories, each stone carrying the echo of their laughter, their struggles, their love for me. When they passed, I quietly placed the property, valued at just over $3 million, into an irrevocable trust under my control. I told no one, not even the closest friend, who knew my favorite secrets. I told myself it was insurance against the chaos I had always suspected would come. And it did. Last week, my sister's voice rang down the hallway, high-pitched with triumph, flanked by my parents' smug, complicit smiles. "We had the house transferred to my name," she announced, already tasting her victory. "You're out by Friday." They didn't know the papers they held were nothing more than illusions, transactions that never touched the real heart of the matter. I smiled then, a slow, deliberate curve of lips that carried the weight of every silent betrayal they had ever inflicted. The kind of smile that doesn't meet the eyes because it isn't meant to. And in that moment, standing under the soft gold light pouring through the tall windows, I wondered if they could feel the storm coiling behind my calm. Because in my world, revenge isn't loud, it's a quiet, calculated whisper. And whispers, when timed right, can shatter entire lives. 2 days later, the crunch of gravel announced their arrival before I even saw them. The moving truck lumbered behind my sister's sleek car, an animal tethered by the weight of her greed. My parents emerged first, their faces stretched into uneasy anticipation, perhaps sensing that something was amiss but too arrogant to believe they could be wrong. My sister stepped out last, her perfume slicing through the air, sharp, floral, cloying, much like her presence. They approached the porch with a swagger that reeked of victory, their eyes already stripping the house bare and filling it with their possessions. But then they froze. The woman standing beside me was not someone they had expected. Her suit was tailored to perfection, charcoal gray with edges so crisp they seemed capable of cutting through the morning fog. In her hands was a thick leather folder, its contents secured by a clasp of polished brass. She radiated the kind of quiet power that makes people instinctively lower their voices, unsure whether they are in the presence of an ally or an executioner. I said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch until it became unbearable, pressing against them like the humidity before a thunderstorm. My sister's bravado faltered first, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. My mother's eyes darted between the folder and my face, searching for some sign of surrender. They would find none. I had built this moment brick by brick, preparing for the inevitable day when they would come for what wasn't theirs. The porch boards creaked under my weight as I stepped forward, my pulse steady, my voice deliberately absent. Because some wars are won without words, just the presence of undeniable truth standing between the predator and the prey. The air between us thickened, almost tangible, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I could see the questions forming in their eyes, but my silence was a weapon I had sharpened over years of their dismissive remarks, backhanded compliments, and whispered conversations they thought I didn't hear. The woman beside me, Miss Hartwell, my attorney, opened the folder with a precise flick of her wrist, the brass clasp snapping like a gunshot in the still morning. Pages fanned out, each stamped, signed, and notarized, a paper shield more impenetrable than any locked door. My sister leaned forward, curiosity momentarily overpowering her arrogance, but Miss Hartwell didn't offer the documents for her to see. Instead, she held them at her side, as if reminding everyone that control wasn't something given, it was taken, earned, defended. I watched my father's jaw tighten, the faintest twitch betraying his frustration at being left out of the loop. 4 decades, he had been the one orchestrating moves, deciding outcomes, pulling invisible strings. Now the strings had slipped from his hands, tangled in knots only I could untie. The wind stirred the ivy climbing the porch columns, a soft hiss that sounded almost like laughter. I thought of my grandparents then, of my grandmother's steady gaze when she told me never to underestimate the darkness that can grow in a family's shadow. I thought of my grandfather's careful hands guiding mine when I signed my first document, teaching me the gravity of ink and paper. Their absence was a hollow ache, but today it was also a shield. My family had come to take the house. What they didn't know was that they were about to lose far more than that. The moment fractured when Miss Hartwell's voice cut through the tension, measured, unhurried. Each word weighted like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't need to raise her tone. The cadence alone demanded attention. She explained, with surgical precision, that the property had never been in my legal name since my grandparents' passing, that all transfer attempts they believed were successful had, in fact, been meaningless gestures recorded against an empty shell. The true title, the living heart of the estate, was safeguarded within a trust that required my explicit consent for any action. I watched the shift ripple through them, my mother's mouth tightening into a pinched line, my father's shoulders stiffening as if bracing against a blow, my sister blinking rapidly as though reality could be blinked away. The sun caught on the porch railing, casting fractured beams across their faces, illuminating every crease of disbelief. My heart was steady, but there was a quiet roar in my mind, an undercurrent of indication that threatened to swell into something dangerous. Not satisfaction. No, this wasn't about pleasure. It was about balance being restored, scales tipping back to where they belonged. In the distance, the moving truck driver leaned against the vehicle, sensing the tension but unaware of the storm's true size. Somewhere in the trees, a crow let out a harsh call, slicing through the charged air. I thought of every moment they had looked past me, of every time my worth had been measured against what they could take from me. Now, they stood on my porch, realizing they had nothing. Not the house, not the control, not even the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. My sister's composure cracked first. I saw it in the slight tremor of her hands, the subtle retreat of her posture as she tried to mask it with indifference. But her eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, betrayed her. They darted between me and Miss Hartwell, searching for an angle, a loophole, a chink in the armor. There was none. My mother stepped forward then, her perfume carried by a faint breeze, sweet but suffocating, like the forced affection she had perfected over years. She began to speak, her voice low and coaxing, the same tone she used when she wanted me to agree to something that only served her interests. But her words slid off me like rain on glass. I thought of the nights I'd overheard her on the phone, conspiring with my sister about the future of the estate, as if I were some temporary tenant instead of blood. My father remained silent, but his silence was not neutrality. It was the silence of calculation, of gears turning behind a mask that had fooled outsiders for decades. The sunlight shifted, spilling gold onto the porch floorboards, highlighting the scuff marks from years of my own footsteps. Every corner of this place was woven into my history, the carved banister polished by my hand as a child, the echo of my laughter bouncing through the hallway during storms. They didn't see the home, they saw the prize. And prizes could be taken. That was their mistake. This wasn't a prize, it was a legacy, one I had been entrusted to guard. And now, as their plans unraveled before them, I felt the faintest echo of my grandmother's voice in the back of my mind. Never let them forget whose ground they stand on. My gaze swept over them slowly, deliberately, the way a hawk circles before descending on its prey. The porch seemed to expand and tighten around us all at once, its boards absorbing the weight of decades of unspoken accusations and invisible scars. I could almost see the moments that had led us here layered in the air, my sister's smug glances at family gatherings when she thought she'd earned more of our grandparents' favor, my mother's coldly polite dismissals of my achievements, my father's strategic absences whenever loyalty might have cost him comfort. They had always mistaken my quiet for weakness, my patience for passivity. In truth, I had been collecting every slight, every betrayal, and storing them like currency. Miss Hartwell closed the folder with a muted thud, the brass clasp clicking shut like the final lock on a prison door. The sound was small, but it carried finality, the way a judge's gavel does. I noticed my sister's lips part as if to argue, then close again. There's a particular kind of silence that comes when a person realizes they are no longer the predator in the room. Somewhere deep inside, I wanted to revel in that shift, but instead, I kept my expression unreadable, giving them nothing to feed on. A leaf drifted from the oak overhead, spinning lazily before landing at my feet, and I thought of autumn, the season of endings, the quiet decay before renewal. This was that season for us. The old order, where they schemed and I endured, was dying here on this porch, and I had no intention of reviving it. The silence between us became oppressive, pressing against the edges of the morning like a storm trying to force its way in. My sister shifted her weight, her heels scraping against the gravel in a sound that felt almost like retreat. My mother's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in the sharp calculation of someone realizing she'd underestimated the opponent across from her. My father's gaze flickered, landing briefly on the lawyer before sliding back to me with a flash of something, resentment, maybe even fear, that he quickly buried beneath his practiced composure. The wind moved through the trees in a low, restless sigh, rattling the porch lantern so it tapped gently against the siding. In that sound, I found a strange rhythm, a reminder that this moment was not chaos but choreography. I had orchestrated every beat, the timing, the documentation, the witness to their humiliation. My grandparents had trusted me with the estate, yes, but also with the dignity of our name. That trust was not a gift, it was a charge, a weight that could only be carried by someone willing to defend it, no matter how personal the war became. As I stood there, I could feel the house itself behind me, not as an object but as a living testament to resilience. Its walls had weathered storms, both literal and human, and still it stood. I realized then that this was not just about revenge, it was about preservation. And preservation sometimes meant closing doors, even on those who once shared your blood. My sister finally spoke, her voice brittle, carrying the sharp edge of someone used to winning but suddenly aware the ground beneath her had shifted. She dressed her words in false civility, each syllable dipped in the kind of politeness that masks contempt, but her eyes betrayed her, cold, glassy assessing. She tried to frame herself as the wronged party, weaving a narrative in which I was selfish, ungrateful, even cruel. My mother nodded faintly in agreement, the choreography of their alliance practiced and familiar. My father remained still, but the tightening of his jaw told me he was measuring the cost of his confrontation. Behind them, the moving crew lingered awkwardly by the truck, glancing at each other as though silently debating whether they should leave before they became collateral damage. The sun had risen higher now, its light cutting clean lines across the porch, splitting us into pockets of shadow and brightness. I stayed rooted in the light, knowing the image alone spoke louder than any retort. Miss Hartwell didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth in her folder was enough to smother every falsehood they tried to summon. My sister's voice wavered for the briefest moment, and in that crack, I saw her fear, not of losing the house, but of losing the illusion of control she had built her entire life around. The porch boards beneath us felt like a stage, and I knew this act was coming to its inevitable close. They thought this was about possession. I knew it was about power. I let her words dissolve into the air, offering no rebuttal, no flicker of acknowledgement, because sometimes the deepest cut is not to strike back but to stand unshaken. My silence unnerved her more than any argument could have. A cloud slid over the sun, dulling the light, casting the scene in a muted gray that felt almost prophetic. The estate loomed behind me, its tall windows glinting faintly like watchful eyes, bearing witness to the confrontation. I thought of the countless mornings I had spent here alone, tending the gardens, walking the creaking halls, memorizing the small imperfections in the woodwork that no outsider would ever notice. This wasn't just land, it was a living map of my history. My mother shifted, the faint creak of her leather bag breaking the stillness. My father's voice finally emerged, low and measured, each word chosen as carefully as a chess move. He tried to reframe the conversation, speaking of family unity, of shared responsibility, but I could hear the hollow ring beneath his tone. It wasn't about unity. It never had been. They wanted to rewrite the ending of a story I had authored from the moment I signed the trust papers. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere far off, a promise of cleansing yet to come. I straightened, my feet planted firmly against the wood, and I knew in that moment they understood. This battle was already over. The first raindrop struck the porch rail with a soft pat, almost imperceptible, but it felt like a signal. More followed, dotting the wood in scattered constellations. The movers, sensing the shift in weather and in mood, began to edge toward their truck, muttering under their breath. My sister's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin, pale line as if willing herself not to speak again. My mother looked away, her gaze wandering to the ivy-covered columns, perhaps to avoid the reality in my eyes. My father remained in place, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, but the stiffness in his stance betrayed him. The rain deepened, a steady rhythm against the roof, washing the dust from the air but doing nothing to cleanse the tension. Behind me, The open doorway framed the dim interior of the house, the rich wood panels and the faint scent of cedar spilling outward like a reminder of what was at stake. Miss Hartwell stood motionless, her presence a silent wall they could not scale. I felt the urge to speak, not to taunt, but to seal the moment in their memory. I told them, in an even tone, that they were trespassing, that the trust was airtight, that every legal avenue they might attempt was already closed. No threats, no raised voice, just facts delivered with the precision of a blade drawn slowly across silk. The rain gathered strength, pooling in the driveway, and still none of them moved. It was not defiance. It was the paralysis that comes when a person realizes the game they thought they were winning had ended long before they arrived. Lightning split the sky in the distance, illuminating their faces in a brief, unflinching glare. For a heartbeat, they looked stripped of their defenses. No practiced smiles, no feigned civility, just the raw recognition of defeat. The thunder followed, low and rolling, wrapping around us like the growl of something ancient and patient. My sister's fingers twitched at her side, the urge to lash out written in the tension of her shoulders, but she swallowed it, the way a gambler swallows the urge to throw good money after bad. My mother's lips moved as if she might offer one last plea, but the sound died before it reached the air. My father's gaze finally broke from mine, sliding toward the wet gravel, an admission more potent than words. The rain began to spill from the edges of the porch roof in thin silver sheets, a curtain between them, and the house they had once thought was theirs. I breathed in the petrichor, the damp scent of earth after the first heavy rain, and it felt like the ground itself was siding with me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear my grandfather's voice, steady, certain, reminding me that strength wasn't loud. Strength was standing when every force tried to push you down. As the wind swept across the drive, sending the last of the ivy's leaves tumbling to the ground, I knew the truth had settled in their bones. Whatever they had come to take was already lost to them, and the only thing they could carry away now was the weight of their own choices. The storm fully arrived then, rain cascading in steady torrents that blurred the edges of the world beyond the porch. Water drummed against the truck's metal frame, ran in rivulets along the driveway, and traced dark veins through the pale gravel. My sister took a step back, instinctively shielding her bag from the downpour, though the real damage to her had already been done. My mother adjusted her coat, her movements tight, mechanical, like a marionette whose strings had been abruptly pulled by another's hand. My father, ever the strategist, studied me with a kind of clinical detachment, as if memorizing the shape of this defeat for future battles he might yet imagine. But there was no future battle. The trust had been crafted with the kind of foresight they had always underestimated in me, woven with contingencies that left no space for loopholes. I felt the pulse of the house at my back, the way its presence seemed to stand with me, not as a possession, but as a legacy breathing through every creak and sigh of its timbers. The rain had soaked their victory clothes, dulled their sharpness, left them looking smaller against the grandeur of the porch columns. I realized then that this moment wasn't just an ending, it was a reveal. Every facade they had worn, every mask they'd maintained, had been stripped away, leaving only the naked truth of their hunger and my refusal to feed it. And though they would walk away, I knew the echo of this day would follow them like a shadow they could never outrun. The clouds began to break, shafts of late afternoon sunlight piercing through in jagged, golden columns, illuminating the porch and casting long, distorted shadows across the wet wood. My family stood there, drenched, powerless, their eyes flicking to the house as if seeing it for the first time, not as the prize they had imagined, but as an unyielding force that refused to bow. I could feel the tension in the air loosen slightly, not because they had accepted defeat, but because even they recognized the futility of contesting what was already settled. I stepped closer to the threshold, letting the warm sunlight kiss my damp hair, feeling the power of the moment anchor itself deep in my chest. Every betrayal, every whispered conspiracy, every night spent listening to their schemes without acknowledgement, it had all led to this. I thought of my grandparents' photographs on the mantel, their faces frozen in smiles that somehow conveyed approval across the distance of time. In that space between the fading storm and the returning sun, I felt a rare calm. I had not sought revenge for its own sake. I had sought justice, protection, the reclamation of a legacy that was mine to defend. And in standing there, the folder still in my hand, soaked yet pristine, I realized that my victory was more than legal. It was moral, emotional, and irrevocable. Their silence spoke louder than any argument could, and I knew that from this moment forward, the balance of our family had shifted irreversibly.